She stepped into the apartment, and noticed the silence first, that heavy kind that sits on furniture and late sunlight. The coffee mug in the sink was clean and upside down. His sneakers were gone from the mat. On the table waited a craft envelope, a glossy 4x6 face down, and a ring that no longer caught the window's gold. She knew it belonged to a moment that had already happened but hadn't yet reached her. The envelope felt heavier than paper. The photo felt colder than a tile. The ring felt like the last honest weight on the room. She knew before she opened anything that he had left her the truth. The city had taught both of them to count their breaths. Sirens were a weather pattern. Construction cranes were a constellation. She, who kept her hair pulled back and her calendar full, made maps out of messes. In meetings, she floated numbers that made rooms nod. She worked in glass buildings that reflected the skyline back at itself and called it progress. She measured outcomes and timelines and talked about corridors of growth as if they were hallways in a house she could keep tidy. He came from streets that moved differently. He could point to a mural and tell the names behind the paint. He taught history at a community center that used to be a church. On weeknights, he stacked folding chairs and coached teenagers through scholarship essays. He was light on his feet in rooms where everyone wore heavy stories. He kept a toolbox in the trunk because there was always a hinge or a railing in need of an ordinary miracle. They met at a neighborhood forum where development slides turned into raised hands. She spoke about mixed-income units, transportation hubs, and catalytic investments. He asked about displacement, and who paid the bill for promises that arrived with barcodes. The exchange had no winner. Afterward, outside under a street lamp that hummed like a tired bee, they discovered a shared skill for holding contradictions without dropping them. They learned each other's names and more than names. They learned how to sit on a stoop and pass the heat between them like a story. Time built its scaffolding. They moved in together. Inside the new apartment, the walls were thin and the light was kind. She liked the way he left books in stacks as if building small cities on the floor. He liked the way she labeled jars as if preserving the future in careful handwriting. They bought a cheap rug that softened the echo of footsteps they hadn't yet taken. Underneath the softness lived unasked questions. He didn't talk much about the night his cousin never came home from a traffic stop that became a custody crisis that became a funeral. She didn't talk much about the summer she took a consulting role on a project that promised revitalization and delivered faster rent. They both had learned the survival skill of looking forward. They both confused silence with peace. Now and then, something snagged. The evening news would flash a neighborhood name, and he would stand too long at the sink. A report would come across her desk about an area enforcement partnership, and her chest would tighten like a fist being polite. But they were good at gratitude. They knew their luck. They built routines that gave their days a shape. He learned to love her lists. She learned to love the way he didn't need one to remember what mattered. They wore the ring for a month before they scheduled a date, laughing that the ceremony already lived in how they cooked, how they kept promises small and kept them anyway. The city kept teaching them to count breaths. They kept counting. The future felt nearby, like a door ajar. The first thread pulled itself. It was small and could have been ignored. He was at the center after closing when a teenager asked if redevelopment meant the basketball court would get better lights. He said he hoped so and asked who told him the center might move. The boy shrugged and mentioned a flyer from a firm with a clean logo and a familiar tagline. The firm's name prickled his memory. He took a photo of the flyer and pocketed annoyance the way others pocket coins. The second thread tightened. A neighbor brought over a box of old paperwork from a shuttered tenants' union, asking if he might know where to archive it. He set the box beside the toolbox, and told himself it could wait. But paper has its own gravity. That night, while she showered, he lifted the lid and found brittle minutes and maps with red grease pencil lines that looked like veins. Behind the maps, a memo photocopied into grainy permanence described a pilot for concentrated enforcement to prepare a corridor for investment. The bullet points were sterile. The outcomes were not. In the margin, an initial looped and slanted in a way his eye knew. He closed the lid and told the air to hush. He told himself proprietary templates get shared, that initials repeat like street names. He told himself people change, and that the past is a messy filing cabinet anyone could get lost in. He told himself to ask. He didn't. Instead, he followed paper to places paper leads. During lunch the next day, he sat in a public records office that smelled like dust and effort. He scrolled through scanned attachments, and found a presentation with her firm's branding, prepared during the very summer she never spoke much about. On one slide, a recommendation whispered like a command, aligned civil code enforcement and police presence to encourage voluntary relocation prior to acquisition. The footnotes cited complaints logged not by residents but by prospective buyers. He felt the room tilt. He steadied himself with the old trick of counting doorways. Memory offered more threads. That same summer, he had been at a march after a local father was detained on his own porch. He remembered how the line of officers moved like a fence closing. He remembered a row of suits watching from the sidewalk, clipboards lifted like shields. He had been shoved, bent his hand, and learned what bones can say. Someone had taken photographs that night. He had forgotten them on purpose. Now he found a community blog still alive on a forgotten server, its archives preserved by neglect. He scrolled and scrolled until the browser coughed up an album from that march. Image after image logged names he never knew or had tried not to keep. In one frame, the suits were clear, the clipboards clearer. A woman with her hair pulled back, her posture attentive, her face a quiet calculation. No caption said her name. The initials on the memo did not shout either. But the combination spoke in a voice the heart recognizes. He printed the photograph and printed the memo and laid them beside each other at the kitchen table the way a teacher lays objects for a lesson. He considered the ring nearby, its circle pretending to be simple. He waited for the sound of her keys in the lock and tried to imagine a version of the world where this was a misunderstanding that could be returned like a wrong-size shirt. The keys did not turn. She had sent a text earlier about a late client dinner. He turned the photograph face down as if the person in it could look back. He made coffee and poured it down the sink. He walked to the window and counted cranes. The letter took hours to write and 10 minutes to sign. He wrote it at the same table where they had argued gently about whether basil belongs in everything. He wrote it without accusation shaped as spectacle and without the softness of a shrug. He wrote what happened to his cousin in the way the story was first called a misunderstanding and then a policy, and then a tragedy that nobody owned. He wrote about the summer of the pilot program, the phrase voluntary relocation that felt like a hand on a chest. He wrote about maps that treat families like furniture. He told her he knew she believed in outcomes and that he had fallen in love with that belief. He told her how faith can become a blade when it goes to work without looking down. He wrote that she once said progress is not a straight line and that he nodded, admiring the humility of it, and that now he wondered how many lives are redrawn to teach that line its lesson. He did not ask her to apologize to the past. He asked himself why he had not asked questions earlier. He slid the photo into the envelope, then took it back out. He wanted her to see it without the buffer of paper. He turned it face up on the table. Her hair pulled back. The clipboard. The line of police closing the street like a zipper. A young man with his cheek against asphalt. His wrist in a bent position he recognized. In the corner, a Polaroid timestamp, the most neutral witness any story gets. He set the ring down beside the photo, then moved it so that the band crossed the image's bottom edge, a small eclipse on a night captured in flash. He imagined the life they had planned, the ceremony in a municipal garden he had wanted because he could bike there as a child, the vows that would name the ordinary miracles in public, the reception where his aunt would offer recipes in lieu of toasts. He imagined the moment someone would mention that love is patient. He thought about how patience feels to the displaced. He thought about weather patterns that follow people like last names. She came home later than usual, and her steps, measured, distracted, approached a door that no longer contained their day. He was not there to watch her unspool the thread. But the room watched, and rooms remember. She put down her bag and saw the envelope, the photo, the ring. She touched the ring first because it was a language her body spoke without translation. It was warm from the way light behaves on metal. She looked at the photo and did not at first recognize herself because people in images are always versions of themselves they do not consent to meet. Recognition arrived like cold air. The clipboard. The seal on the memo printed on the back of her mind. The loop of her own initial, a small river bending around its own logic. She opened the envelope. The letter told a story she had organized around professionally and avoided personally. It returned her to meetings where she had talked about compliance and timelines and had not noticed the shifting weight of words. It took her back to that night of the march when a supervisor had suggested observation as a kind of wisdom. She remembered the heaviness of the clipboard, how it steadied her hands and silenced her stomach. She remembered writing a line in a memo about aligning resources and feeling like she was playing a game on a board where pieces were neighborhoods and the dice were grants. The ring sat between letter and photo as if asked to be a translator. It could not translate anything. It only reflected the room back to itself. Mourning does not fix anything. It merely refuses to keep secrets. She woke with the letter on the table and a new knowledge that did not ask for denial, only for choosing. Work sent a calendar invite for a status review, and the city sent its usual noise. She moved through tasks like a respectful ghost, then closed her laptop and read the letter again. Words do not change when you reread them. They only change the reader. She set the ring in her palm and felt both the promise and the harm it now carried like twin seeds. Accountability is a plain word until it is an address. She opened old folders and found the memo in its original context with her initial clear and no ambiguity left to rent. She traced her career's path and counted, as best as numbers allow, the buildings that had risen where histories once slept. She wrote to her supervisor a resignation that did not frame itself as a sabbatical or a pivot. She attached the memo that had kept her awake and the minutes of the meeting when the phrase "align enforcement" had been praised for efficiency. She cited no heroism, admitted no single-handed power, and refused the comfort of helplessness. She used active verbs because harm had used them first. Afterward, she walked to the community center with the mad idea that she could return something. She found the office closed for the afternoon, but the gym alive with noise. She stood in the doorway long enough to recognize the courts as more than rectangles. She saw a volunteer installing a handrail where an elder had slipped last week, measuring twice, cutting slow. She thought of how solutions look like love when they do not need a press release. She left an envelope with a donation and a note that did not seek absolution, only the permission to listen. She understood that permission is not granted by letters. It is earned by showing up to be changed. On the walk home, she passed a mural where a young man in sky blue held a basketball and a book, his mouth drawing breath to speak a future tense. She had never noticed the names faded at the edge, the dedication to neighbors relocated in the year the pilot became policy. She noticed now because the letter had moved furniture in her mind. He was 2 cities away by then, staying with a friend who knew the landscapes of leaving. He woke early and made coffee that tasted like deciding. He wrote to the teenagers at the center, a message about the next scholarship workshop and a promise he could keep without the door of his old apartment. He called his mother and listened to the kind of silence that heals when someone sits still inside it with you. He placed the toolbox in a borrowed trunk and drove to a church where a clinic was building shelves for free. He lifted wood and remembered how the body thanks you for things that do not require theory. He did not delete her contact. He did not put the letter on social media. The work before him did not need an audience the size of the internet. It needed an address and a schedule. It needed the humility to do small things without calling them small. He sent emails to a legal aid office about the records he had found, attaching scans of the tenants' union minutes and the memo that had grown heavier in reproduction. He asked if a case could be reopened, not as a crusade but as a correction. He admitted he was not objective and that objectivity had sometimes excused indifference. In the weeks that followed, the city continued to count itself in cranes and corridors. The redevelopment project stayed on course because inertia is a cousin of power. But disruptions gathered at the edges, patient and exact. A series of hearings reopened, not as spectacle but as audit. An editor at a local paper accepted a piece written without adjectives that let the numbers speak their unromantic language. A council member who had learned to hear raised a vote from abstain to no. A landlord paused an eviction in the face of a suddenly attentive public record. None of it made the news beyond the neighborhood. All of it made mornings less dishonest. She kept the photo. She kept the ring in a small dish with loose buttons and a subway token from a city that no longer took tokens. She began to spend her days differently, which is to say, she began to spend them. She took a position with a clinic that helped residents read the lines in the leases that loved to hide their teeth. She learned to sit in meetings where people cried and did not rush the agenda. She wrote no memos that used alignment as a euphemism. She kept a copy of the letter in a drawer and touched it when she felt the itch for speed. He coached and wrote and repaired what he could. On weekends, he visited his cousin's grave with a folding chair and the stubborn insistence that memory is action when it refuses to be only pain. Sometimes he drove back to the old neighborhood for a day and walked past the apartment. He did not go up. He did not need to. He could feel the silence from the sidewalk and know it was doing its work, which is to say it was being filled with new noise, new meals, new music. The envelope he had left was now one artifact among many in a life still ongoing. Betrayal is a word with sharp edges, but it is also a lens. Through it, they had seen the architecture of a love built partly on unexamined foundations. Through it, they had seen how loyalty to a person can be used to excuse disloyalty to a people. Through it, they had learned that a ring can be both a promise and a mirror. They had learned that leaving can be a form of telling the truth when staying would be a form of lying. They had learned that remorse without repair is a poem in an empty room. On a rainy afternoon months later, she stood on a porch in a part of the city where porches still carried evenings. She handed a tenant a folder with documentation that would buy time to renegotiate a rent pitted with traps. She explained the process without preaching and left grateful for the chance to be ordinary help. On a bright Saturday, he watched a student open an email and learn the word scholarship the way some people learn sunrise. He clapped in a way that made his palms sting and did not mind the ache. Pain had better uses now. The photo remained on her desk, tucked into the frame of a calendar. She let it accuse her without allowing it to paralyze her. The ring remained where it was, a circle that refused to lie and refused to punish. Sometimes she imagined, not a reunion, but a conversation across a city, both of them working at tables in different rooms, breathing in sync without planning to. She did not build a story that promised repair as romance. She learned to let repair be its own honorable ending. The apartment, years later, held new laughter. The city, as ever, tried to measure itself. A map somewhere gained a new note in the margin, written by a person who once mistook impact reports for absolution, and now understood that numbers are just one kind of apology. And the question she kept near, the one that would not leave her alone, lived on the other side of every policy paper and every promise. If love asks for a future, what do we owe the past that made our present possible, and who pays when we decline the bill?